Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 1st of June in the 22nd week of 2012. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke and David Green. We'll take turns suggesting overlooked or misreported items from the week's news, and then answering questions or comments from the other two about what's been said. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the 20 years that we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Today is Friday, June 1st. On this day in 1932, 1,000 U.S. veterans of a war that had ended 14 years before arrived in Washington, D.C., demanding support in the Depression. In the days and weeks that followed, new contingents arrived until about 15,000 veterans and their families were camped in Washington. They established a rough camp on what's called the Anacostia Flats next to the Anacostia River, from which they were eventually driven by troops commanded by Generals MacArthur, Eisenhower, and Patton, the latter two then junior officers. Even before the election of Franklin Roosevelt, it had become clear to American rulers that war was to be the American answer to the Great Depression. On this day in 1967, in the midst of another war that Americans were only gradually becoming aware of, 5 years after JFK had invaded South Vietnam, Vietnam Veterans Against the War was formed. The anti-war movement, of which that was an early part, caused Lyndon Johnson not to run for re-election as president. And on this day in 1968, the so-called events of May in France, the student uprising that had been joined by the workers, was finally mollified by the largest general wage rise in history. But not before the French student-worker rebellion inspired a student strike at Columbia in the U.S. and then at other U.S. universities and then elsewhere in the U.S. anti-war movement. Mark Twain is supposed to have said that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. The child killer in the White House today is perhaps more aware of those rhymes than most Americans, for whom the 60s, to say nothing of the 30s, is the distant past. But Obama has written about it in his books, and it's hard to see recent events as not responding to the possibility that he would have to face the same sort of anti-war movement that characterized the 1960s and indeed the 1930s. They're working on it, and what they're doing to prevent it seems to me is little short of indefensible. Barack Obama wants to head off repetition of the 60s, and to that end, in a shameful ceremony this week, he gave the Medal of Freedom to Bob Dylan, who would have done much better to break into song about fastening all the triggers for others to fire, sitting back and watching the death count get higher. Meanwhile, this week, the former head of state, Charles Taylor, got 50 years in prison for his role in the 14-year Liberian Civil War, which killed perhaps 250,000 people. Bush stood with Obama and got an oil painting in the White House. Quote, "I'm pleased my portrait brings an interesting symmetry to the White House collection," he said. It now starts and ends with a George W. Close quote. So as our last two chief magistrates wrap themselves in Americanism, we might want to raise some questions about exactly what they're doing. We recall that George Bush's role in the Iraq War, over 1 million dead, bore no interest for the International Criminal Court. Such nice people, such pleasant company, writes Vijay Prashad. Yes, that's true. You're watching News from Neptune, the History Rhymes edition. And we'll start with the red-capped Ron Szoke.
My pretext for the Red Beret will come out later, but I have another point first, two main points actually. One about Obama's kill list, and the second one about the uprising in Quebec. So first of all, there was a lengthy article in the New York Times by Joe Becker and Scott Shane with the headline, "Secret Kill List Proves a Test of Obama's Principles and Will." So it describes the process by which people are put on the list to be killed by American drones in the Middle East. Whether that will eventually spread to other areas of the world remains to be seen. But these reporters say, after interviewing a number of people about the process of getting people's names on the kill list, that Mr. Obama is personally supervising this. Quoting, "He is determined that he will make these decisions about how far and wide these operations will go," said Thomas Danielian, his national security advisor. His view is that he's responsible for the position of the United States in the world. He's determined to keep the tether pretty short. So once again, we get the testimony that he's using it only moderately and with restraint. And it's amazing, some people, that there's nothing in his record that, or in his first term, that has so baffled, this says, liberal supporters and confounded conservative critics alike, so much as his aggressive counterterrorism record. So there's plenty of anti-Obama stuff out there. You can read endless attacks, mostly on irrelevant grounds, but all of the vitriol coming from the right wing has nothing to do with the principal objection to that I would have to Mr. Obama's behavior. His current and former advisors, these reporters say, describe a paradoxical leader who shunned the legislative deal-making required to close the detention facility at Guantanamo Bay in Cuba, but approves lethal action without hand-wringing. When he applies his lawyering skills to counterterrorism, it's usually to enable and not constrain his ferocious campaign against al-Qaeda, even when it comes to killing an American cleric in Yemen, a decision that Mr. Obama told colleagues was an easy one. Quoting, his first term has seen private warnings from top officials about a whack-a-mole approach to counterterrorism, the invention of a new category of aerial attack following complaints of careless targeting, and presidential acquiescence in a formula for counting civilian deaths that some officials think is skewed to produce low numbers. That is done by the resolution not to count people who are not in a certain male and not in a certain age category, and so on. It's absolutely amazing to read that stuff. The administration's failure to forge a clear detention policy has created the impression among some members of Congress of a take-no-prisoners policy. Mr. Obama's ambassador to Pakistan, Cameron Munter, has complained to his colleagues that the CIA's strikes drive American policy there, that is in Pakistan, saying he didn't realize his main job was to kill people, a colleague said. Beside the president at every step is his counterterrorism advisor, John O'Brennan, who was variously compared by colleagues to a dogged police detective tracking terrorists from his cave-like office in the White House basement, to a priest whose blessing has become indispensable to Mr. Obama, echoing the president's attempt to apply the just war theories of Christian philosophers to a brutal modern conflict. There are claims here that Obama has been reading Augustine and Aquinas, looking for justification in their just war theories of the killing of people in the Middle East. All this is too much even for the editors of the New York Times, who are generally supportive of Mr. Obama and most of his behavior. Too much power for a president, this says. And it goes on to complain that degeneration has occurred, really. The moral objections to killing civilians, unknown civilians, nameless, who may or may not be American citizens, thousands of miles away by people sitting watching computer screens within the USA, is too much even for these people who are otherwise his supporters. And there are a number of qualifications here. The New York Times editors say a unilateral campaign of death is untenable. To provide real assurance, President Obama should publish clear guidelines for targeting to be carried out by non-politicians, making assassination truly a last resort, and allow an outside court to review the evidence before placing Americans on a kill list. So this has inspired a response by some people. This was in Common Dreams. A growing petition urges Obama to create a do not kill list. In the wake of the New York Times report earlier this week, which reported President Obama's that he personally oversees a highly secretive and kill list, and amid growing concern over the Obama administration's targeted assassination program, a creative petition drive has taken hold on the White House's own website, which calls for the creation of a do not kill list so that American citizens can sign up and avoid being executed without indictment, judge, jury, trial, or due process of law. So as of 3 p.m. Thursday, 2,321 people had signed the petition. And if the petition receives 25,000 signatures or more, according to White House policy, a formal response will be offered by the administration. So you can look for the petition on the White House website, sign up, and enter your plea or prayer not to be killed by the drones that are apparently so fascinating to Mr. Obama.
Incredible.
And I'll leave that point there.
It's astonishing. Thank you, Ron. Comments, David? You mind?
I noticed that the New York Times published a couple of letters in response to this. I guess it was a response to the editorial that Ron referred to. One of the letters was from the head of the ACLU saying that they would continue to oppose this policy, and certainly justifiably so. The other was the best they could do, I guess, was to publish a letter by someone who basically said, well, it seems like that that Obama, that in terms of the balance of powers, Obama isn't accountable to anyone, or that there isn't any legal basis for this, but in fact that Obama is in fact accountable to the people of this country, and that they use the phrase, this person writing this letter used the phrase, "the buck stops with us." That is, the citizenry of this country, presumably to throw Obama out of office if they don't like such policies. I think it's a rather lame argument, but it's what passes for an argument among those who simply don't want to, who want to avoid the idea that that Obama has put himself in a place in which he can kill people outside of any sort of legal or judicial framework and not be held accountable for that.
Yeah, here's the response of one person. Cindy Scott wrote in to Mr. Sirota, David Sirota, who apparently initiated this petition idea. David, could you at least focus your outrage at Romney and save the criticism of Obama until after he gets reelected?
Isn't that something? There are several of those. One is we can't criticize the drone strikes now because that gives ammunition to Romney.
Yeah.
That is. I mean, even the ammunition image is. I mean, it's surreal. It really is a most astonishing swallowing of evil that I've seen in a while in American politics. It really is. The notion of the chief magistrate being accountable to the people for murdering citizens and citizens of the U.S. as well as foreigners, for murdering people around the world. If that question had been raised, and it's so outrageous that it probably wouldn't have been raised at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, the framers would have pointed to Article 2, Section 4, which said when the chief magistrate commits high crimes or misdemeanors, he's to be impeached, and the impeachment should lead to, on conviction, removal from office. This was the way in which they made a criminal chief executive responsible to the people, as the letter writer David Quotes asked. But of course, that's fallen into desuetude. We don't use that, and it would have been far better had we used it a good number of other times. But the accountable to the people thing makes sense only if you realize the Constitution has been completely bypassed here, that what Obama is doing is obviously unconstitutional, and yet the constitutional remedies break down. We can't use them. We're in a post-constitutional or a trans-constitutional situation whereby the crimes are so great that there is no redress. We've set a head of state of a minor state off to 50 years in prison this week, but I don't think Mr. Obama need worry about that.
Yeah, it's interesting that George III never needed or wanted any greater power than this, and the two main villains of recent political discussion, Hitler and Stalin, once again, never really needed or wanted anything more than the ability to kill selected opponents. Just by pointing out that I consider them enemies of the state.
The English king at the time of the American Revolution did not have that power. In fact, there had been a great deal of struggle about it, including a revolution, about the sorts of things that the king could do to a citizen. Principles had been set down as long ago as the 13th century, limiting much more or limiting sanctions against citizens far short of murder, far short of summary execution on the part of the executive. But here we have, in the 21st century, an executive done with this. And the thing, I must admit, one of the things that bothers me most about that incredible press release, which the New York Times printed as an article this week. It's a straight press release from the White House. It's their argument, an argument that even, as Ron pointed out, made the editors of the New York Times just a bit abashed, and they've been willing to swallow a good bit that the Obama administration has done. The thing that bothered me most was this image of Brennan as the priest somehow blessing Obama's murders. I mean, this is worthy of Renaissance drama. I mean, Brennan, people should know who he is, a nasty old spook who was too involved in torture to be appointed head of the CIA by Obama when Obama came to office. This is not a nice man. And to connect that with the notion that Obama is reading pages of theologians like Augustine and Aquinas in order to think about the just war tradition, in order to justify what he does, this is outrageous. The just war tradition, which I take quite seriously, it seems to me, as a good conservative, I should point out the relevance of the just war tradition. The just war tradition would condemn out of hand any of this activity by Barack Obama. And to say that Brennan of all people, should be the one applying these priestly sanctions, these priestly approvals, is amazing. There's a further development here that I would like to see some of my American co-religionists do something about. Brennan is being given an honorary degree by Fordham University, a Catholic university in New York. Now, a number of American bishops are in court right now suing the Obama administration over its mandate for contraception and abortion being covered in the health plans that these prelates offer their employees. I think they should look at those materials on the just war, rethink the honorary degree to Mr. Brennan, and go into court perhaps about the much greater enormities that the administration is performing in this particular matter. It's amazing.
So you can't picture Mr. Brennan as the priest saying, go my child and kill some more.
Yeah, well, that's obviously what he's doing, you know, and there is something particularly outrageous about the priestly designation for John Brennan. You're listening to News from Neptune. We have a number of enormities to talk about today, I'm afraid. This one blows a lot of others away, I suppose. Let's go to David Green. What's on your list, David?
I think I've got a pretty good one to throw into the pot here, not unrelated to what we've been talking about. Over the Memorial Day weekend, of course, there's a lot to deal with symbolically and propagandistically in relation to how the holiday unfolds in various ways. And one of those ways was Barack Obama visiting the Vietnam Memorial in Washington and declaring that, the next 10, 12, 14, 15, 20 years would be spent in a campaign to honor the veterans of the Vietnam War, which apparently, according to Obama, need to be the veterans of the war and their image and the appreciation for their what is always called service needs to be better appreciated and better understood and better honored. It's clear that the political and propagandistic aspect of this shouldn't be lost on anyone who understands anything about the Vietnam War, anything about the rebellion against the Vietnam War in this country, and particularly the rebellion by the soldiers themselves, who were fighting it. And I would just like to remind the viewers that there's already, of course, a long-established history of revising our memory and promoting a lack of understanding about the Vietnam War. Two basic references that I would make in regard to this have to do with, of course, the mythology of returning veterans being spat upon, which was debunked in a 1998 book by a man named Jerry Lemke, Lembcke, called the spitting image, and the other mythology, perhaps more prominent at this point, or at least prominent at one point in the last decade or so, had to do with the whole mythology surrounding the POW MIA, missing in action issue regarding Vietnam War vets, which got got sort of souped up in the late 70s and early 80s, what with the Rambo films and all that, and was quite exploited during that period of time, and which has been refuted, analyzed, and refuted in books prominently, most prominently by a literary scholar named H. Bruce Franklin in a book called Vietnam and Other American Fantasies, published in the year 2000. I think that was one of two books that he wrote with essays related to this issue. That's H. Bruce Franklin. And I would just like to add, and I think this is very consistent with some of the comments that Carl made in his introductory remarks to this show, is that it's clear that, for one thing, it's clear that given every Memorial Day that goes by, there are fewer World War II veterans to honor and to kind of point to as symbolic of the goodness with which America invades other countries in this world, the good intentions and the good and heroic outcomes, and the need for honoring their service. I'll put honoring their service partly in quotes and partly not in quotes, so as not to sound at all cynical about the sacrifices that have been made by many people in many wars. Nevertheless, this always comes with a certain amount of obscurantism and romanticism and propaganda regarding the motives for such wars, including World War II, the nature of such wars, a certain mythology about the lack of proper respect to veterans returning from that war, in which, if anything, the lack of respect, especially for Vietnam, was evidenced by those who supported the war and blamed the vets for not winning it, and beyond that, not being provided with the proper services to reintegrate them into society, given the issues from that war. There's a lot of complicated issues that come with the notion of returning vets, which are all reduced to basically nothing, basically cliches. One of those, perhaps a more controversial one of those, might be the sort of stereotype of veterans suffering from PTSD. It's worthy of noting. I don't pretend to be any kind of an expert on this syndrome or this issue, but it's worth noting that there are some people who represent vets, and some political critics, I think, including Alexander Coburn of Counterpunch, who has questioned the diagnosis of PTSD and the manner in which it has been used to sort of stereotype vets. So let me say that Obama's very political decision to declare this Memorial Day as sort of the start of this campaign to honor Vietnam War vets is a very political move, a very sort of cynical move, and it should be seen for what it is, and it should be seen as an opportunity, certainly one of many opportunities, but as an opportunity to rededicate ourselves to clarifying what the Vietnam War actually was as a sort of criminal action by our government, and not to hide behind not to exploit and hide behind the veterans of that war in order to justify our current wars, which is obviously what's being done here. Let me just conclude by saying that it's clear every Memorial Day, and on many other holidays as well, Veterans Day, Fourth of July, September 11th, any of the days of the year in which the history of our military is brought front and center, that these, in spite of the fact that it continues to be claimed that individuals died for our freedom, it's clear that these are framed in a context in which the nature of these wars, for better or worse, can't be talked about. It can't be freely talked about and understood in a way that might help us to avoid, to oppose current wars and avoid future wars.
Thank you, David. Comments, Ron?
No, of course, these holidays are always subject to exploitation by the politicians. And some interesting material started to appear recently about the returning veterans, the much higher rate at which they are claiming injury and including PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and the rest. It's really hell there in the Middle East, and a lot of the generalizations we may have in mind about those injured in past wars may not apply here, and it's just a hopeless mess to me. People don't realize the extent to which other people get mangled. The pain, suffering, and expense goes on for decades and generations after you have a war. And are we looking after those people? First of all, trying to prevent them from going to war as much as we can. I always view a war as a failure of diplomacy. And it's always an indication of, and every war is an indication of incompetence, diplomatic incompetence otherwise. And I protest, but
I wish I could believe that, Ron. I mean,
Yeah.
Incompetence, no. I mean, unfortunately, incompetence for evil, perhaps, would be a better way to put it. And I mean, things. The notion that unless diplomats and statesmen act rightly, things will collapse into war is a view that comports fairly well with a liberal account of modern society. But it seems to me that if we actually ask about the particular wars that have occurred in our lifetime and so forth, in each case we're talking about a consciously chosen policy for rational ends. By calling them rational, I don't mean that they're reasonable or much less moral, but rational in the sense, in Weber's sense, of putting means to ends. You want to do something, and this is the way to do it. The wars of the 20th century, and we're talking primarily, of course, about American wars, are rational in that sense. Not a failure in terms of mechanics, but a failure in terms of ethics. And in that sense, it seems to me that we're quite right to condemn them. But in order to condemn them, we have to give a good account of what actually happened. All the examples we've been talking about here tonight have been wars that have been aggressively reinterpreted for the benefit of the next generation. The First World War, the Second World War, Vietnam. People in the subsequent generation, in each case, had a far less accurate notion of what the war was about, what was done in the war, and the politics that led up to it and came out of it. I mean, going back to take a non-American example, at the end of the First World War, Germany included a large number of people who condemned their leaders for setting out on the war policy in the first place. In order to deal with that condemnation from the German populace, a quite sophisticated stab in the back rationale was developed to explain how it was the fact that it was the action of radicals and communists and others who prevented Germany from prevailing in the First War, and that these disloyal elements should be dealt with in any future wars. One famous book published in the 20s analyzing the war pointed out that the real reason Germany lost the war was that the Americans and the British were better at propaganda, better at explaining what they were doing than the Germans were, and the Germans lost because they didn't have as good arguments. That won't happen again, wrote Adolf Hitler in the book in question, in which he analyzed these failures of the First War. Now, David's point about Vietnam, by the early 1970s, 70% of Americans thought that the war in Vietnam was a crime, a moral failure, not a mistake or a blunder. And that had to be dealt with. That had to be reversed. And we found a generation of American scholars and pundits busily doing that. Barack Obama seems to me to be an heir of this. I mean, here's a man whose political career has been based on covering sin with smooth names. He is a liar of the first order, a very accomplished liar. He got a lot of Americans to believe that he was opposed to the war in the 2008 election, and then in office proved more brutal and efficient at war than his predecessor. The smooth lying that Obama does is being applied here in a way, I must admit, I found surprising to the war, and it's joined to his a certain cold-bloodedness that leads one almost to speak of a sociopath in his method of carrying on the war, as you were describing. I can't help but feel that this is a propaganda exercise like that of 2008, but redoubled in spades in the sense that he's facing a real problem from another direction, and that's the economy. If Obama is not reelected in the fall, I think it will be primarily because people vote against the bad economy, that James Carville was right to tell Clinton years ago, it's the economy, stupid. And they're trying, Washington, Obama and his people now are trying to trump the bad economy. We had new numbers today about very small job creation and so forth, very few jobs created and so forth. They're trying to trump that by producing one of these legends of American arms that even includes Vietnam. He talks about this in his own books, how he does not want to be, he said the biggest problem, the greatest casualty of the Vietnam War was the loss of trust in the government by the people. Yes, well, there may have been a reason for that loss of trust, right? But he wants to restore that trust to his administration as a way of fighting this next election. And reading things like Charles Krautheimer's piece in this morning's this morning's News Gazette makes me think that he might get away with it.
Yeah. Well, just a couple of quick comments that I can't deal with adequately. There is a myth that the returning veterans from Vietnam were treated with contempt. They were scorned and spat upon and so on. And it's never been possible to really document that. We had another go-around on that point in the local press 3 or 4 years ago. Some people claim to have seen instances of it, but I didn't find it convincing at all. And I'm not surprised that politicians try to make use of that myth when they can. Mm-hmm. But in any case, this goes back to a standing issue between Carl and myself. He likes to emphasize the vicious motives of these people, and I remain agnostic about a lot of that. I just like to look at their behavior and the consequences of their behavior. So I'm not sure whether it's fruitful at all to try to attribute long-standing evil intentions to them to personalize matters and talk about their motives, and so on.
I contend that I'm not talking about their motives.
Well,
I'm
yeah,
talking
you
about their
always
actual behavior.
you always quickly
Well, look,
retreat to that.
The question is, what did Barack Obama do to get elected president? He made himself the anti-war candidate. Was he the anti-war candidate? No. If you examine what he actually said before the war and before his election and what he did in office, it's very clear that he was simply lying. His motive for lying, he may not have known he was lying, in which case his motives would be quite different. I'm not interested in his psychology. I am interested in what he did and in what the body politics made of it. What happened, the body politic made of it. What happened politically depended upon his lying about his views about what he would do as president.
Let me just add to what I was saying about Obama and Vietnam, is that it's clear to me that maybe it's not clear, but I would posit that World War II is thought of as the good war. That's the war we always want to talk about first. Unfortunately, but still, time marches on, can't do anything about it. We're running out of World War II vets.
Yep.
So we need Vietnam vets.
Right.
And what Obama did this past weekend is basically say, Vietnam vets, it's your turn to play the role that World War II vets have been playing for the last 30 years, as symbolizing the goodness of U.S. wars.
Yes.
And how do you do that? I mean, you have to forget everything about that war. You may not have to twist things. I'm not saying Obama is raising the POW MIA issue. He didn't raise the spitting issue. He just sort of raised the sort of general issue that somehow they haven't gotten the respect that they ought to have gotten after coming home from the war. Yeah. And then you descend into this silly, stupid sort of welcome home kind of thing where everybody has to be sort of re-welcomed home every single day to show how much we honor and appreciate their quote-unquote service. And of course, the last group of people that gets asked about how they might like their service to be thought of, or this war to be thought of, are the Vietnam vets themselves. Nobody really speaks for them, just like nobody really speaks for the World War II vets anymore in any kind of complex way. They've just been reduced to, as they've gotten older, of course, they're less able to speak for themselves, whether as a result of being dead or very old. And the Vietnam War vets are still young enough to speak for themselves. And I think the ones that are still living are young enough to speak for themselves. And I think that they should, in a very clear way. I didn't do a thorough search in regard to the response to Obama's speech about this, but I did come up with one article on Huffington Post, which I think was a very good article by Rick Ayers, who happens to be the brother of Bill Ayers, and lives and teaches out in San Francisco now, and basically giving, I think, a very appropriate response to what Obama was up to in this declaring that the next decade is to be the decade of the Vietnam vet.
And one thing to be clear about in this struggle over the Vietnam vets, which I think David has outlined quite accurately, there were people, of course, who were remarkably scornful of Vietnam veterans in the 70s and throughout the 70s when they returned home. And those are the people who condemned the veterans for not fighting harder, for not winning the war. The people who said, no, it was a terrible thing for us to withdraw from Vietnam, we should have stayed on, we should have used more, we should have used nuclear weapons, et cetera, et cetera. Those are the people who scorned Vietnam veterans at the time. The reason being, and this is the point that really has dropped out of the, it was never in the history books, it was the revolt of the American Army in Vietnam that led to the U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam. Parenthetically here, I might say that the notion that the U.S. lost the Vietnam War, I've always thought was quite false. The U.S. didn't achieve its its total war aims in Vietnam. But if you look at the countries in the generation after the Vietnam War, I mean, Vietnam was destroyed. It was destroyed from carpet bombing and chemical warfare and everything else, to the point that within a generation it was begging to be included into the to exploit its own workers for the benefit of American companies. I mean, you know, if that's not a victory for the sorts of things that America was trying to do in Vietnam, I don't know what would be. But in any case, the actual withdrawal of American troops in the 70s came about because those troops revolted. Those troops refused to fight in the way that they had been sent to fight. That's the reason we don't have a draft army anymore, a conscript army. We had to go to a mercenary army because the conscript army was unreliable. The people who condemned those vets were the people who condemned them for not fighting. So it's a way in which the actual history of the war, including the revolt, gets into the national consciousness. The people who are there know what happened, but we can't say that quite yet. And it's the attempt to try to adjust that national consciousness that the Obama administration is busy at these days.
It's a variant on the old stab in the back idea that we didn't get a clear victory there because of disloyal elements at home or in the army and so on, the revolting students and so on.
Yeah, let me just also make it clear in regards to my comments before about PTSD. I perhaps wasn't clear enough in just saying that there are some who kind of question a stereotype of veterans as being mentally ill, and that they see there's another, in spite of the consequences of the war, which Ron rightly referred to, on the people who fight in it, that there is another aspect of that in terms of how vets are treated in this country and sort of what the expectations are there. And there are some people who claim to represent vets, I think sincerely do represent vets, who caution that particular label and the way it's been used, maybe not in a clinical sense or maybe more in a popular sense. So anyway, that said.
Yeah. Another point that you made, Ron, about the recent publication of the large number of veterans who are applying for various and sundry forms of relief. One of the reasons I mentioned the Bonus Army in 1932 today. The Bonus Army arrived in Washington because of the Depression. As much as because of the war. And it seems to me that these American, the one real difference between veterans who came home in the 70s and veterans who come home today, veterans who came home in the 70s came home to a rich country in which there were plenty of jobs. There was no recession. It was about to hit, but it hadn't. And the veterans who come home in the first decade of the 21st century come home to a very different economic situation. And it's not at all surprising that they should be looking for the sort of supports that they need that may not, in fact, have been quite so necessary 40 years ago.
I wanted to reserve my extended remarks on this question until next week when we talk about Aware on the Air. But I want to squeeze in, before we stop, if I can, the situation in Quebec.
Good.
And why I'm wearing the red beret.
And thanks to you, we're wearing these. Yes,
yes, the squarely in the red. It's a revolt, perhaps we could call it that, by the students in Quebec, Montreal and Quebec City, about the sudden rise in their tuition costs for attending the universities there. And it's putting a lot of them in debt. That's the meaning of being in the red. It's creating a kind of subdued crisis in this country. Also, the extent of student debt, the student loans, and so on. It is the next crisis after the mortgage debt problem. The students are often graduated now from college in this country with debts $20,000 to $100,000, and it's treated differently from any other kind of debt. They're not allowed to declare bankruptcy, and there's no limit to the time over which these can be collected. And it's an amazing situation, and I'm surprised that not more is being said about it, and why there hasn't been more objection to it. So that's the issue. this has come out a couple of times in the New York Times recently. Our not so friendly northern neighbor, Quebec, has passed a repressive law, Bill 78, making it almost impossible to have legally public demonstrations of protest and so on. And
but all in all, the New York Times hasn't done a very good job of covering
No, indeed.
what's
another
going on up
headline.
there. It's almost
Nobody has.
absent.
Yeah, Canada, hundreds arrested in Quebec at a protest over tuition increases. The increases are small by American standards. They pay relatively less than a lot of people to attend university there. So the latest one I've seen is Quebec student protests continue, but compromise is likely. Nightly protests against tuition increases continued across Quebec over the weekend, even after provincial government passed an emergency bill this month limiting the right of assembly. However, student leaders signaled that they might compromise soon, Montreal media reported. So university and college students have been protesting in Quebec, French-speaking Canada, for 15 weeks. Bill 78 passed after a late-night session in the Quebec National Assembly, limited protest actions, and so on. Over 500 people were arrested there. There was in Agence France Presse a piece by one Francisco Toro, which was highly unsympathetic, claiming that the students should be protesting because the actual amount that they're paying and going in debt to pay is not large by American standards, typically far smaller. He writes, I find the entire controversy puzzling. How can an ostensibly left-wing movement want to force people who don't go to college to help pay via their taxes for the education of those who do? How is that progressive? And this evades the whole point.
Yes, it does.
The education of those people is a public good, and
Right.
it will ultimately redound to the benefit of the whole body politic, but he's viewing it, as many people seem to want to do these days, as a consumer good for which people should be made to pay because it will contribute to their own future prosperity, which seems to be an incredibly short-sighted and stupid approach.
This is a crucial point, and it seems to me it's worthwhile noticing that the economist Doug Henwood wrote a piece a while ago that's been passed around again recently, that there is no economic reason that higher education in this country, and he was talking about the United States, but mutatis mutandis, it applies to Canada as well, there's no reason that higher education shouldn't be free,
Yes.
that there is no economic reason to make it, not to make it free when you see it as the sort of good that Ron was just describing. And in fact, the flip side of that is that there are many people who suggest that this explosion of student debt in the U.S. in recent years is quite a conscious program to prevent precisely that sort of critical opposition to national politics and particularly to war that characterized the 1960s and 70s. If you have students in a overwhelming debt peonage, they're not going to fuss as much.
Yeah.
And the very real difference between the anti-war movement on the college campuses of the 60s and 70s and what happens in universities today, I think is at least in large part due to precisely the situation. I saw some of that myself a little while ago. I retired as a visiting professor at the University of Illinois 10 years ago, and about, 5 years ago, I came back to teach a course after not teaching for several years, and was quite surprised at the different attitude of my students even in those few semesters when I'd not been teaching. They apparently were much more oppressed by the notion of the sort of debt they were carrying and the necessity to behave in such a way that their future jobs were secured. Now, there'd been a pretty serious financial and economic crisis in this country in the interim, but the fact of the matter was that student debt here was being used as a conscious way of controlling the sorts of protests that Mr. Obama is so much concerned about controlling today. These things things are not disconnected. You have been watching Aware on the Air for the 1st of June.
Actually, it's
Sorry,
It's,
it's a
what show
slip.
is this?
I haven't made that slip before, I don't think. You've been watching News from Neptune for the 1st of June.
I just want to make sure I was in the right
Yeah.
right show. That's
Well,
all.
it's your fault for changing the
Yeah,
recording
right,
time, David.
right,
It's not the fact that my mind is, my arteries are hardening as much as people are unkind enough to suggest they are. This has, in fact, been News from Neptune for the 1st of June in the 22nd week of 2012. Our program is named in honor of Noam Chomsky. This has been the History Rhymes edition. And one more rhyme, Ron's last point here about what's going on in Montreal, I think has more connections with the events of May '68 in Paris than we were able to bring out this evening, in the sense that what started as a student demonstration in Montreal has become an anti-austerity demonstration and involves a lot more than students. And that's what's got both the provincial and the federal government in Canada worried, and indeed governments worried elsewhere as well. If our program has interested you, you might want to look at these programs to be seen on Urbana Public Television. Tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., the David Pakman Show. At 2 p.m., a repeat of this show, which is News from Neptune. Sunday at 3:30 p.m., the Populist Dialogues, Healthcare as a Basic Human Right. At 4 p.m., Labor's Worldview. Weekdays in the coming week at 7 a.m., Democracy Now!, 8 a.m., The Big Picture, and at noon, the David Pakman Show. On Monday, the 4th, at 2 p.m., the Tom Hartman program. This is a 3-hour live call-in program. Either of you watched any of Hartman's call-in program in the afternoon? But it seems to be finding an audience, which is all to the good. That's here 2 p.m. on Monday. On Tuesday, at 5:30 p.m., European Journal from Deutsche Welle, and at 10 p.m., what is this program called? Aware on the Air. Yes, 10 p.m. That'll be on Tuesday. Okay. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight on News from Neptune have been Ron Szoke and David Green. This and other editions of this program can be seen on the website newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com and on Facebook, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Thanks to our director, Caleb, and to Jason as well for making arrangements for today's program particularly. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, that what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you. Wear your red square.